Welcome back to Betoota Talks. We are in the lead up to a federal election. As we're recording this, it hasn't been called yet. There's not many other dates it could be. But, you know, we took a break from the politics during the cyclone. We interviewed Irish singer-songwriter Dermot Kennedy. We thought best to leave the politics out of a natural disaster, which we at Betoota Advocate always do. So now we're just going to talk about the campaign. Now we're just going to talk about 2025, the state of Australian politics. You've got myself, Clancy Overall. I'm joined by Wendell Hussey, the Eternal Cadet. And today's guest, back again, Senator Hume. Thank you for joining us.
Back by popular demand.
Yes.
I'm loving that.
Yes.
Big time. Great feedback last time, Jane. And it's good to be getting back into it. Clancy and Errol, they big fans of the Emerald Isle, so it was good for them to talk Guinness and Gaelic football and Irish ballads and all that sort of stuff with Dermot Kennedy. But yeah, now we're getting back in because it's a May election by the looks of it, but it'll creep up pretty fast, I think.
Senator Hume, do you like campaigns? I can imagine that there's some people in politics who do.
Yeah. They are. Look, they're seriously hard work.
Yeah.
They are very demanding. They're extraordinarily long days. Like you can see yourself doing 16, 17-hour long days of just work. Yeah. And there's a lot of things that you do that are really high adrenaline, whether it be, media or speeches or even just standing in front of a train station saying, hi there, I'm Senator Hume and this is the candidate for XYZ. Have you met them yet? Answering questions from punters. All of that. It actually, that can be exhausting. Sure. But the adrenaline is, fantastic. Yeah. And the buzz, I think, during an election campaign is really important too. And it changes from day to day. You have good days, you have bad days, but, it's all about sort of chipping away, making that progress towards election day. Yeah.
Can you remember the first, bad day on a campaign that you had where you just went home and you went, God, what am I doing?
Look, I'm trying to pick a specific for you. I mean, I've worked on campaigns as volunteers, and there are some elections, and I'm thinking more of Victorian state elections, where you just know you're up against it. People don't take your how to vote cards. You take it very personally when people don't take your how to vote cards. Yeah. I will say my partner, he's worked on every campaign since he was about 16, and he works in the really hard seats, and he gets out there in the morning, he puts the signs out at 6 o'clock in the morning and he packs them up at 6 o'clock at night, then he goes in and scrutineers. And there are days where 90 people will take his how to vote card. He reckons last time was the worst. He was in Collingwood somewhere, and they don't take too many Liberal how to vote cards in Collingwood. I'll give you the drum. And but he worked out the day after that he had COVID. The worst thing was he probably gave them the 90 people that voted Liberal in Collingwood. He probably gave them COVID.
It's a very Melbourne affair, that, isn't it? And actually, in terms of nightmare campaigns, I do remember hearing 2016 Turnbull's election against Shorten, and it was 6 weeks in the middle of winter.
8 weeks, middle of winter. Can I tell you, I've never been snowed on during a campaign before, but I was standing in Ballarat and it snowed on me while I was handing out how to vote cards.
That's hard work.
That's tough.
Has much changed in terms of handing out how to vote cards? Are people more emboldened to say things or less, or has there been any changes over the years?
Oh, look, everyone's, quite either they will just look straight ahead, keep their headphones, AirPods have made all the difference. Give you the charity mugger treatment.
Yeah. Just this one.
Yeah, exactly right. But also a lot of people get their how to vote cards on their phones now or take a screenshot, so they don't feel like they need to take something from you at the gate of the primary school or whatever it is. There's still no shortage of people that are happy to give you a free character assessment on the way through, but that's kind of the job.
Yeah. Do you find that grassroots level though? Your partner, he's in the front line. He's the avant-garde of the Liberal Party in the Labor strongholds of suburban Melbourne. Do you find that is the most effective at the end of the day? You can have algorithms, you can have online campaigns, you can have social media strategies, you can have ads in newspapers, but you've got to at least have that connection.
Yeah,
do you find that
absolutely
works?
do.
Yeah.
You know, the more people that get out there wearing a blue T-shirt and say, I'm happy to, proudly live these values, that makes all the difference, which is, why the two big political parties are so keen to get out there and campaign that real grassroots stuff on street corners, in front of train stations, getting the job done. And we're seeing that more and more. The idea that, you're not just part of a political party, you're part of a political movement is really powerful. It inspires people.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing we're seeing in this kind of post-social media world where, people do love to get out. They do love getting out and about. And voting is exciting. For post-pandemic, you would have given anything during lockdown to go and line up and vote, right?
Well, it's that idea that you are part of something that's bigger than just you and that you can personally affect change. I think that that's really important. And you go to a Liberal Party meeting and there are people of different ages, there are people that have very different jobs, there are people with very different perspectives and backgrounds, all nationalities, but they have certain things in common. They believe in freedom and choice and personal responsibility and reward for effort and supporting small business and lower taxes, and that idea that it's really important and fundamental to who we are as human beings to look after those in society that can't look after themselves, but not necessarily give a free ride to those who won't look after themselves. And that's what we all have in common, even if we have different opinions on a particular, micro policy, whatever it might be.
How do you go? I mean, that sounds like your beliefs there, the conversation about lifting and leaning and, people who can't look after themselves and people who won't look after themselves. How does this marriage with the National Party work? Because when you really break down the National Party, and we have met a lot of MPs and senators from the Bush, from the National Party, from the Shooters and Fishers Party, from the Qatar Australia Party, even One Nation. What a lot of these people have in common is eventually they ask for some form of socialism, whether it's drought aid, whether it's, investment or bailouts. And we see this all through the Bush. That's kind of Bush politics because life on the land is tough and it's extreme and it's unpredictable. But do we call that socialism?
No, look, I actually think that people understand just how important our regional communities are. Let's face it, we're a country that, rode on the sheep's back for many, many years. Agriculture and indeed our mining are two of our most important, economic strengths, our core equities as a country. So we know that when we see something like a natural disaster, that it's really important that we come to people's aid. We want to make sure that we have industries that are going to support our food bowl, for instance, that, they feed the cities. But we also want to make sure that we support our export sector as well, because when we can work on those, those strong suits, those core equities, we're boats that rise on the tide. That's the prosperity of the nation there.
So you view these regional communities, we've got a school with 12 kids. I tell you, Margaret Thatcher would have closed down a school with 12 kids.
Margaret Thatcher had a much physically, geographically smaller country to deal with. Whereas we know that sometimes those communities need support, they just to deliver on what it is that their promise could be. And they need things like infrastructure that's going to deliver productive capacity. So that's kind of sounding.
And it's an investment. You view that as an investment in those, like one that pays out tenfold.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, there always has to be value for the taxpayer dollar. That should be our first port of call. But the second is, what productivity is this going to deliver to the economy? Is it actually going to enhance our economic growth, or is it detracting from it? That's so important, particularly in the position I've got now as Shadow Finance Minister, because I know that it's not just about pulling back on the expenditure, although that is really important, but it's making sure that our expenditure doesn't grow faster than our economy. Now, that's a recipe for disaster. So you've got, two sides of that ledger. There's the expenditure side and making sure you've got all the fiscal discipline and the guardrails around budgets and making sure that, there are rules that are followed. But at the same time, how do we inject productivity back into our economy so that we grow faster and expand the pie rather than just cut it up differently?
Clancy mentioned there a little bit about how the elements of socialism can creep into bush politics and things like regulating a price on milk.
Agrarian socialism, we'll call it.
Yeah. One thing I'm curious about, we asked Susan Lay about it and didn't really get much of an answer. I'm curious to know what the plan is pending this ACCC finding regarding the supermarkets. What's happening? You guys have mentioned divestiture and breaking them up, which is essentially the state interfering in the private market, right? Which I think a lot of punters will agree with. Like, on two companies that couldn't be more on the nose right now, Woolies and Coles. But what does it actually look like, and what's the plan there if you're elected in May?
Yeah, so I mean, look, let's start at the end here, where divestiture is the in emergency break glass option. And it's really about a sector where there is so little competition that a couple of very big players can take advantage of the lack of consumer choice. But look, for the most part, the big supermarkets are good employers, they're good corporate citizens. We just want to make sure that that they're doing right by everybody in a consistent way. And there is no doubt that we have heard stories about things like land banking, which one of the big supermarkets will buy a big parcel of land, particularly in regional communities, and just sit on it rather than allowing a competitor to come in and take that likely piece of land. Now, that's the sort of, when we talk about divestiture, we're not talking about, every supermarket has to be sold off to somebody else. But if it's a very specific,
fruit shop.
if it's a very specific example like that, you can see where it would come in. Now, again, this is the last port of call. The most important thing here is that we make sure that we have a specific commissioner. I think we've said that we would do that will make sure that complaints from suppliers can be made to the ACCC without potentially revealing who they are. So it can be done anonymously so that there isn't risk of retribution. But if poor behaviour persists and there is no other lever to pull, well, this should be the ultimate threat. And let's be honest, this is not an anti-liberal, in inverted commas, policy. It's existed in the States, it's existed in the UK. It's very, very rarely used. The Standard Oil case is the one that everybody sort of cites, and that was decades and decades ago. But it is that it recognises the importance of competition to get a better consumer outcome.
Now, we spoke in the lead up. The last time we spoke was in the lead up to the 2022 election. We didn't really know what was going to happen then. There was a few surprises, right? You were kind of confident in Scott Morrison's government and Scott Morrison's team and the Liberal Party to come back in, right? And you have to be confident. It's your job. You're in a campaign, whatever. I'm not going to ask if you were or not. But it wasn't a win. And I know, as a St Kilda fan, you, of all people, can deal with a demoralising loss or a very near loss, a very near win. What do you think happened in 2022 compared to, what you thought would happen and, what happened to the government that you were part of that ended up, losing seats to independents particularly and losing seats in WA and, the shock?
You're asking the right person this question because I was actually asked after that election with my colleague, Brian Loughnane, write the review of what went wrong in that election. And that review was very comprehensive. We spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people, campaign workers, parliamentarians, campaign professionals, and pollsters about what they saw that had gone wrong. And there were recommendations that were for the professional wing of the party, for the organisational wing of the party, and also for the parliamentarians themselves. And I wouldn't actually put it down to one single thing. It's not one single personality. We'd been in government for 9 years. 9 years is a really long term, and people, there is a sort of mood for change, want something different. They particularly want something different if they've had 3 crap years. Oh, I'm swearing again. There's all lots of, but they were, hey,
they were shit years.
They were shit years. Those COVID years were really tough, and people were itching for something different from what they had just experienced. So inevitably, that was a factor. Now, even though we had come through with extremely good health outcomes, extremely good economic outcomes, that didn't make a difference at the end of the day. People just wanted something different. There was also things that had gone on through that period of time. The whole sort of, I think the sort of Brittany Higgins thing manifested in a sense that somehow the government was anti-women, and it really was. I mean, speaking as a woman that was in the government, the things that we were doing were just so important. That we'd lowered the gender pay gap to record low levels. We had 50% of our government board appointments went to women. It was a really good government for women, but it was an easy criticism, I think, and there was a couple of probably mistakes made in that part. For the first time, and this one I feel very deeply. For the first time in that election, the Liberal Party lost the women's vote in every age demographic. We'd never done that before. In fact, it used to be that more women voted Liberal than men. I think maybe as the union movement's become more feminised, that might have changed up. People see themselves better reflected in that female union movement than they used to. But that said, trying to sell, even though we'd done a good job, you can have more of the same if you keep voting for us, was always going to be a difficult sell.
That's why we want to talk about let's get back on track. Yeah. Because more of the same, is it just like a 3-year break from more of the same? What does get back on track mean? Because
where is track?
Where is track? Are we talking Abbott? We talking Turnbull? We talking Morrison? We talking pandemic?
Well, that's a good question. So I think in the last 3 years, people have actually seen themselves go backwards. Even if they didn't like the way they felt at the end of the pandemic, they didn't go backwards. They weren't poorer. Whereas in the last 3 years, standards of living have gone backwards, and they've gone backwards by about 8%. And that's largely due to high inflation, high interest rates, and higher taxes. And of course, higher interest rates and higher taxes are related to higher inflation. Because inflation has been too high for too long, all of those things have been affected. So people's standard of living and their quality of life has gone down. It's not that you just feel poorer, you in fact are poorer than you were. And Deloitte are now saying that to get back to the standard of living that we had prior to the pandemic is going to take until 2030. So that's kind of depressing. I think people feel like that the government lost its way a bit, particularly on the voice referendum. I mean, let's face it, that was 18 months of campaigning for something that at the end of the day, Australians pretty clearly said that they didn't want. And while that was happening, there were 12 interest rate rises. And you think, mate, you're taking your eye off the ball of what's really important here. People are now paying on the average mortgage about $50,000 more in interest rates, just in interest repayments, than they did 3 years ago. And that's $50,000 that they're never going to get back. It's not money you find down the back of the couch. So you can see what poor economic management can deliver, and that's why I think that people have the baseball bats out this time around. In my home state of Victoria, which is the canary in the coal mine for a badly managed state, poor economics, poor energy policy, and a bad Labor government, that is the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the country. Because
it's not going to be Queensland anymore because you've got everything in Queensland.
Well, but the anger down there is visceral. Yeah. You can feel it. People will stop me in the street, stop me in the supermarket and say, keep going, we've got to get rid of these guys. And I don't know whether they're talking about state or federal, doesn't matter, but they're angry.
I want to talk about The Voice. Look, no one really likes to talk about factions, but you would be more of the moderate faction, hence why you were asked to write the review of the election.
I like to think it's because I'm very eloquent and,
I'm very
good writer.
High functioning, and you can speak truth to power. But, the Voice did feel like what you're saying, baseball bats. Regardless of what the question was, which a lot of people didn't understand, and it was a very confusing time. And as you said, interest rates went up 12 times during that campaign. People took the baseball bats out against the government, which was a shame for the Indigenous kind of community leaders that had spent 10, 20 years putting this together. Where did you stand on The Voice? Were you, as a moderate, initially supportive of it, like Josh Frydenberg was, like Ken Wyatt was? Were you supportive of it? Did you backpedal from your position? Did you then join the government's position? Because we all do remember from that whole thing. One thing we remember is Dutton treading water until he could gauge public sentiment before he declared a position.
Yeah, I think that everybody started open-minded. They said, well, I really like the idea of having recognition of our Indigenous heritage and our Indigenous population in our constitution somewhere. It's important to recognise that and be really proud of it. It was simply the way that the voice itself manifested in that change to the constitution that essentially created two classes of Australian citizen that people went, well, hang on though, I'm not entirely sure how that works. And because it was sold on, well, don't worry about that, it's the vibe. But I think it actually meant that people worked out that they really valued their citizenship. They valued the power of their vote, and they didn't want to see it trumped, for want of a better expression, overruled, let's say, by a particular group, any group, minority, majority, it doesn't matter. One citizen, one vote is really, really important, and I think people felt that was getting lost with the voice referendum. Then there were silly things that the government made mistakes. Their first decision was to say, we won't have a referendum booklet. We don't need that. Because people they'll vote on the vibe, and no. You've got to be really clear with people what it is that you want. I was really pleased that the coalition negotiated to get that back in. You can't vote without informing people about what it is that they're voting about, and the government just couldn't answer the questions about how this thing was going to work. So that natural hesitation, that natural reticence, I think that is common in all referenda. If it is a big change, I want to understand why I'm voting for this change. We actually, believe it or not, are naturally conservative in this country. We don't like change for its own sake.
Yeah. I mean, referendums prove that time and time again.
But it's a lost opportunity. I mean, I think that's really important. It was a lost opportunity. It could have been done so much better. You could have brought the nation with us if it just had have been a much more palatable, modest change. Now, I think activists probably got hold of the situation.
Got hold of it. Qantas should have been nowhere near it.
Crazy stuff, Once big politics, big activism, big corporate start advocating with something, average Joe sits back and goes, hang on, what am I missing? What am I being sold here?
One of the, obviously, taglines was, if you don't know, vote no. And you talk about the public getting confused. One thing I've heard a lot of people confused about is how exactly this nuclear plan is going to work. Can you give us some clarity on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually pretty simple in the broad. At the moment, the vast majority of our power is delivered by coal. And that has been the source of our prosperity as a nation for decades, and particularly, again, in my home state of Victoria. You can have, if you want to have a manufacturing sector, you've really only got two choices. You can have cheap labour or you can have cheap power. We chose cheap power as a nation because we don't believe in cheap labour. So, but as that coal retires, and it absolutely will retire, we've got to replace that with something. Now, renewable energy is terrific and it will always have a place, and it will keep on growing. There is going to be continuing investment in renewable energy. But at some point we do need baseload power to support it. And gas is the first solution. It must be the first solution. We've got to make sure that we can get those approvals for new gas projects up and running to support the transition. But as the coal-fired power stations retire, they already have the infrastructure, they have the transmission lines, they have access to water, and they are in communities that are very, what's the right phrase, energy. They have high energy IQ. They understand that being close to those power generating sources is an opportunity for prosperity for generations. Those are the places that we will implement new nuclear power generators. Now, what they look like remains to be seen. It depends on the location, and we've identified 7 potential sites, but there will be an initial 2. Those 2 will depend on which ones they are. So they might be, regular nuclear reactors. They might be small modular nuclear reactors. But the technology is moving so far and so fast that the opportunity is kind of endless. The best time to have built nuclear energy would have been 20 years ago. The second best time, though, is tomorrow, which is why we say, let's get started now. You speak to most business and they will say, oh, yeah, it's an inevitability. It'll happen sometime. Might not happen this election, but it'll happen sometime. Well, no, you've got to start it as soon as possible. And
So
actually,
when do we
it's
get the
really
first
exciting.
one?
When those coal-fired power stations retire. And so it really depends on which site is identified by the community as the one that they want. Now, if you look at the WA state election, that was really interesting in Collie, which again is one of those sites that's been identified. It was a huge swing towards the Liberals. So you can see that there is an awful lot of open-mindedness towards this policy in the communities where they would be located. And look, to be honest, I genuinely think this is a policy that's found its time.
Why don't we get someone who's really rich to pay for it then?
Wouldn't it be good?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be good?
We've got plenty of them. Like, we've got plenty of billionaires who have, as you say, high energy IQ. They've come out of mining. We have people that could do
why
this.
is Twiggy on green hydrogen instead of nuclear?
Yeah, look, you're asking the wrong girl that one. You're going to have to ask Twiggy that question. But I think with a new technology for the country like nuclear, and let's face it, it's not a new technology globally. You be eating cheese and drinking wine under the shadow of a nuclear power plant in France, and nobody worries about growing a third eye. But I think for Australia, there is an element of trust that comes with government taking responsibility for making sure that the right people are in charge, that the right safety measures are in place, all of those things, which is why the government should be involved with those first few nuclear power plants. Now, there is nothing to say that we wouldn't have a civilian nuclear industry eventually, but it's right that the government should start it.
Now, there is concern. We're still on nuclear. Sorry, Senator Hume, we're still on nuclear. Australia in 2016 failed to host an online census. The website crashed. That was a new technology, and that was our first attempt at it. Similar things happened with the NBN. We just, is there a trust in Australia pulling this off?
And, can I just point out to you that I like to take some credit here. I asked the Australian Bureau of Statistics about this at a Senate inquiry, and it worked out that they gave me a very complicated answer about what they could have done in order to avoid that census crash. And it ended out if you had have pulled the plug out and put it back in, that it probably would have rebooted and we could have done the online census after all.
Yeah, I'll turn it off and on again trick.
I just hope that doesn't have to happen in a nuclear power plant. Just turn it off and on again.
No, that is true. But look, this is a proven technology that has existed in overseas jurisdictions for many, many decades. Of the top 20 nations, most developed countries, only 19 of them already either have nuclear energy or are working towards delivering nuclear energy. We're the only one. We're the outlier of that 20. So there's plenty of experts out there, and there are some domestic experts as well. If you look at, ANSTO, people like Addie Patterson and Dick Smith, these are people that have already been well involved in this industry and can deliver. Actually, do you know one of the top nuclear energy lawyers is Australian. She's an extraordinary woman, but so there's plenty of talent out there to be able to deliver on this commitment.
We'll stop talking about nuclear. Spirits are high in Queensland, weirdly. They've just had a cyclone. But what tends to happen is everyone comes together after something like this, particularly during floods. Everyone's out there. People can't go to work, so they pick up a shovel. That's a really interesting thing to happen in the lead up to an election where we've kind of got this boost in community. Is this also potentially a problem? Because we've got two different things. For the Liberals, I'm saying. We've got two different things happening here. We've got this community groundswell, whether that be through, flood recovery or through, this teal kind of community-backed thing. They're making moves on Queensland now, and we've got climate change in the middle of all of this. So we've got people on the ground talking about, geez, wasn't it weird that we flooded in 2022? And then before that, it was 2011. But before that, it was 1974, and then it used to be, far and wide between events like this, and we are now noticing that it's happening more and more. Queenslanders don't ever say the word climate change, you know that, but they think about it, and they vote on it. And 3 seats, south side of Brisbane, we're talking car dealership mad mile seats went to the Greens last election. Do you think that this is on people's minds? Do voters vote on this?
Actually, look, there's about sort of 3 or 4 different issues that you just raised there. One of them is when communities come together, and I think that's when we see Australia at its best. And that's when you get organisations like the local Rotary or the Country Women's Association or the Lions Club all doing what it is that they need to do in order to make sure that their community is looked after. I love those people, those that volunteer spirit.
CWA.
They're extraordinary. They're extraordinary. And,
great scones.
Excellent. Don't touch the scones. No one likes a fat politician. But it's really, really important to see that happening. On the issue of climate change, look, you can always say we're going to distinguish between weather events and climate change and, one cause the other. And I did hear, admittedly, one of the teal candidates saying that the cause of the cyclone was climate change. And I scratch my head in wonder at a time when people are sandbagging their homes or, trying to reopen their businesses or even just turn on the bloody lights, that you could talk about this.
But they do want to talk about it because, they didn't run any independents in Brisbane. All they had was the Greens, and they voted for it because the Greens were, as I said, not running on climate change, but they were running on environmentalism and nature.
Yeah.
And that's all one of the same when your house gets flooded every 5 years.
So there are a couple of different aspects. I think that the Teals messaging from the last election has somewhat been blunted. There may be people that want to validate their previous votes, but to be honest, if you look at the 3 abstract nouns that the Teals ran on and that they referred to as policy, they were climate, integrity and gender. Yep. And on climate, the coalition have clearly drawn a line in the sand and said we are committed to a net zero emissions future by 2050. And we have now a credible pathway to get there. We think it is a more credible pathway to get there than anything that Labor is offering because they simply can't deliver on the promises that they're making of having a pure renewables only approach. So let's put the climate side of stuff aside. On integrity, look, is anybody really doubting Peter Dutton's integrity? I think as a former cop and
last couple of weeks,
a
few questions. Savvy share trading.
I reckon it would be, but it would be a pretty brave soul that would do that. I don't think he is a person that has ever demonstrated a lack of integrity, a lack of trustworthiness. Certainly, as someone that has been working for a number of different leaders, I find him probably the best to work for. So I'm looking forward to people that don't know Peter Dutton getting to know him because I think that once you know him, you'll vote for him. And on the issue of gender, again, this is an interesting one. If you are really serious about getting professional women in decision-making rooms, well, why would you not vote for Ro Knox in Wentworth? Because she is an extraordinary woman. Why would you not vote for Amelia Hamer in Kooyong, who has just got this incredible brain and this wealth of experience? Why would you not vote for Giselle Kaptarian with all her tech expertise in Bradfield? Why would you not vote for Jamie Rogers, who is an absolute cracker in Warringah? These are women that are going to be in a decision-making room. And just by virtue of the fact that the Teals have decided to be independent means that they can have as many round tables as you like. They can talk about tax policies, they can do lots of talking, but they can never actually implement a decision because they never have to weigh up priorities. Whereas and one of my favourite songs is from that, the musical Hamilton, In the Room Where It Happens. If you want really professional, capable women with incredible real-world experience in the room where it happens, well, then you've got to vote for people that are in a party, not people that are independent.
Okay, that's a great point, and I really like the knowing the names of the people that are running against Teals. But and their track record, and I know Giselle particularly, is a protege of Gladys and is, well known in her electorate, and that'll be an interesting one to watch. But those seats were all taken by Teals off men. So could you argue that the Teals have led the Liberal Party to this?
Well, we already had a lot of good women in our ranks. And if you look at our shadow cabinet now, we have I think it's equal number. It's certainly the same number of women in our shadow cabinet as the Prime Minister has in his cabinet. And those women that we have these incredible backgrounds. I mean, we've got farmers, we've got, small business people, we've got people that have worked in community sectors, we've got banking and finance like me, we've got lawyers, accountants like Susan. I mean, there's this incredible background. There's such a lack of homogeneity in our perspectives, in what we bring to the table, compared to our competitors in the Labor Party, who have essentially all come through a union movement of some sort. Yeah.
I was probably going to save this question for the last one, but we're getting into it now, and we're touching on the subject. There's a bit of an exodus of talent from the Liberal Party over the last few years, and one of the things you often hear people say is that there's not a lot of other options aside from Peter Dutton to lead the Liberal Party. At any point, will you be dropping down from the Senate and popping into a seat?
You could have gone on the by-election in Aston. You could have been leader by now. Imagine that. Baseball bats would have been out for Albo.
Oh, mate, aren't you too lovely? I'll take the flattery any day, but I am a very happy senator. And you know one of the reasons why I'm a happy senator? Because what I want to be most in the world is the finance minister of this country. And a finance minister, I think, is better coming from the Senate. And the reason why is because I know I'll never be Prime Minister. So I don't care if I have to say no to my colleagues. That's why it's important to have a finance minister from the Senate. I'm comfortable saying no to my colleagues.
Great answer. Okay, so, well, that's a shame. We were going to finish on that one. Let's go back to the talent. This is your chance. They always get told, Liberal Party particularly, after, the 3 sugar hits of leadership changes, that's what they were, really. People were looking at poll numbers. Let's replace this guy. Labor did it a decade before. Rudd Gillard Rudd, Abbott Turnbull Morrison. Julie Bishop was in there for a little bit, but she wasn't electable apparently. And now we have Dutton. Who is behind him? Let's, for example, there's a 1.7% margin on the seat of Dixon that just covered in mud by Cyclone Alfred last week. There's 2 very popular women running against him, one for the 3rd time, another one's a Maroon independent, they call her.
Maroon.
If he loses his seat and the Liberal Party win, who is going to be Prime Minister?
So 2 issues. One, I don't think Peter's going to lose his seat, and I'll tell you why. Because he has built over more than 20 years now very deep ties with his own community. Let me tell you this anecdote. I was in an airport a few years back, and the plane that I was on got evacuated because it had a mechanical fault. And I got into conversation with the pilot while I was sitting in the gate. And he said to me, he noticed that I had my little Senate badge on, and he said, "Oh, you're a politician. Do you know Peter Dutton?" And I said, "Yes, I do." Now, at that stage, I didn't know him very well. I was in the Senate, he was in the reps, I was pretty junior, he was pretty senior, I didn't have a lot to do with him. And he said, I met him at a school fair. I live in Dixon. He said, I met him at a school fair and I was wearing my civvies and just had a quick conversation with him and said that I was a Qantas pilot. He said, 6 months later, I was walking through the airport in my pilot's uniform. And on the other side of the hallway, big hallway, Peter Dutton was walking the other way, about to get on a plane. And he looked over, recognised me and said, John, g'day, good to see you. Peter Dutton, I met you at the school fair 6 months ago. And he said, that's just an extraordinary talent. And I agree, that's amazing when you have that kind of connection with your community. And Peter's got that. So let's put that aside. He's not going to lose his seat. Moreover, there is.
So if he got abducted by aliens, or he went, if he went swimming off Portsea, right, in the hours before the 2025 federal election,
would bring him back.
Yeah. Who's up next? What's the next cab off the rank?
Well, I mean, honestly, we haven't. And I don't want to sound naive here. We honestly haven't thought about it. Peter has done an incredible thing in the last 3 years. It is very, very easy in opposition for people to, tear each other apart. There's a lot of blame shifting, pointing fingers, and that can be a real problem. The Liberals experienced that back in 2008, 9 and 10. And, of course, the problem with that is you get this whole new leadership group, new shadow cabinets. Everybody has to keep learning a new portfolio.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, no, it's less the shredding because we don't have that much confidential information. But it's more about, all of a sudden, oh, my heavens, how did I become the Minister for NDIS? I have to learn a whole new portfolio now. We haven't had that. We've had a really stable and consistent team. He has brought people together because he's realised that, yes, there's lots of different views in the party. We're a very broad church, but, and I'm mixing my metaphors here, it always takes both wings to fly. Yep. And we do best when we bring all of those unique perspectives under the one roof, consider them all, and then make a decision and back it in. And that's exactly what he's done. So I don't think that this is a real issue for the Liberal Party right now. It hasn't been for 3 years, and I don't think it will be in the future.
We spoke a little bit about how tough it can be on the campaign trail. How much support is being offered to that young fella who is running for the Senate in the ACT after the announcement that some public service jobs might go and everyone's going to be back in the office full time?
Okay, well, let me correct you first and foremost. There has been no directive that everyone will be back in the office full time. The most important thing to understand here is that all the public service secretaries got together with the Public Service Commissioner just in 2023 and said, we want to have a flexible workplace. How do we manage this? And everybody agreed that it should be negotiated for the individual. We should be very open-minded to flexible work. It should be negotiated with the individual, with the team and with the department to make sure that we're delivering an effective and efficient public service. And we're all happy with that. But then the public sector union got involved and the finance minister, who is ironically also from the public sector union, made an agreement for an enterprise bargaining agreement that gave public servants the right to demand to work from home full time. So now we've got graduates starting and doing cadetship programs that are working from home. And you think, this is crazy. This is not how to build a capable public service.
How are you supposed to get married in Canberra?
You can see where this is nuts. And we had this ridiculous example where somebody came to my office and said that a member of their team was working from home full time and were very unreliable and hard to get hold of, which you'd expect. I mean, if they're located in one place, how hard can it be? And it ends out that this person was driving a caravan around Australia with their family while they were, in inverted commas, working from home. So this stuff is just, it's nonsense. About 61% of the Canberra Public Service have a work from home arrangement. We're not getting rid of that. Everybody, to begin with, any existing agreements will be honoured. But moreover, it's about establishing a culture. It shouldn't be the default arrangement. It should be a negotiated arrangement so that it works for everybody, not just for the individual. So that's one thing, I think, that's really important. As far as our Canberra Senate candidate, it's always going to be an uphill battle being a Liberal in Canberra. But it's really important that we make sure that our public service is delivering on its promise. A bigger public service doesn't necessarily mean better service to the public. You know, the health departments increased by 40%, but bulk billings collapsed. The size of the environment and energy portfolio has nearly doubled, but emissions are up and approval times have stretched out. So these are the things that we're concerned about. And there are better ways of delivering the service. We just want everybody to, come back to the office and work with me because there's great problem solvers in the public service. They can do good work.
I just think this isn't going to play that. I mean, look, it's a Canberra-centric kind of rhetoric we're talking about now in terms of the public service. But this is one surefire way to turn Queenslanders into Labor voters. This has shades, and I'm not sure if this has been kind of, dissected by your team, but this has shades of Campbell Newman. Came in with, I think he won every seat but 10 in 2012, and he was gone by 2015. And it came down to these kind of remarks about the public service, whether or not they're taken out of context or they're not. When the public service feels under attack in Queensland, they vote Labor. Do you think that's going to have some backlash on you?
I do think that Australians have very high expectations of what it is that a government and a public service can deliver. And let's face it, the size of the public service has grown exponentially in the last 3 years. We talk about 36,000 new public servants, but that's a 20% increase in public servants. It's 40 new public servants every single day since Labor were elected. We think that that is too big. And not only that, but it's not delivering on its promise. So things like the wait time to get an age pension has blown out. It takes 5 times longer to get a low-income card than it used to. There's an hour-long wait on the phone for the Parenting and Families Service. This is not good enough. So what is it that we can do about it? We need to make sure that we right-size the public service to be able to deliver on its promise, but also not crowd out the private sector too. You can't prop up the economy using incredible immigration levels and just continual government spending. That's not an economic plan. That's a Ponzi scheme.
Spoken like a future finance minister.
Hopefully.
2 scenarios. Election night, win or loss. What does each look like? A couple of G&Ts, I'm assuming. Either way.
My predication for a good G&T. Election night is always a big night. And at the end of the day, as long as we're comfortable that we left absolutely nothing on the field, that we have got the right policies, a genuine alternative to get Australia's future prosperity firmly in our sights and to deliver on the expectations and the promise of a nation, well, that's what we want to do. So I reckon I could be very proud of the candidates that we've picked, the work we've put in, and the policies that we'll deliver.
Are you going to be on a panel?
Yeah.
Okay. Where do we tune in?
That's a good question. It hasn't been decided yet.
All right,
I'm in a bit of demand. It's quite flattering.
Well, we thought we might even have you on it on the Betoota's live YouTube election night coverage, but
might have to be a FaceTime.
I can just duck under the desk at the ABC or at Channel 7 and do a little bit of that.
Thank you for being very generous with your time today, Senator Hume.
That's a pleasure.
Love talking to you, and all the best.
Thank you very much, guys. Always good to be with you.